in paragraph 11, we get reference to the human psyche. And obviously one of the biggest problems Dr. Jung had in his lifetime was to get other people to agree that the psyche is real. And so he says that explicitly in paragraph 751 of Answer to Job. And, he says very clearly, and I'll just refer you to it since I have Answer to Job right at my fingertips. It being one of the most important books of Dr. Jung's oeuvre. Okay. All right. So he says, what people overlook or seem unable to understand is the fact that I regard the psyche as real. They believe only in physical facts and must consequently come to the conclusion that either the uranium itself or the laboratory equipment created the atom bomb. That is no less absurd than the assumption that a non-real psyche is responsible for it. God is an obvious psychic and non-physical fact, i.e., a fact that can be established psychically, but not physically. Okay, so anyway, that's the profound page on, on Answer to Job. So what Dr. Jung is admitting is that he had been researching on the collective unconscious since 1913, and he was trying to prove it and have some parallel to it from elsewhere in human experience. He hadn't been able to connect it up properly with the Gnostics because the information about the Gnostics was, when he was writing this, the information about the Gnostics was not clear enough. And so, of course, in 1945, so less than two decades later, the Nag Hamadi Library, I guess it's library, the find that they had in Egypt occurred, and they found the gospel according to John, I think, and they found some other gospels that never became part of the Bible because they were found in 1945, and the Bible was settled in 325. But anyway, but the point is that these items of the psychoid transcend all differences of culture and consciousness, and they're latent presuppositions toward identical reactions. And so, as you can imagine, the Decorah Eagle shows us what how a mother behaves. It's the psychic expression of the identity of the brain structure, regardless of racial differences and parallelism among animals. And the examples are the mother archetype and the warrior archetype. Okay, look. Right, and Gray, that's the point. It is a biological claim as well as a psychological claim. So it's a continuum that starts in the instinct, which is a biological claim, over to the spiritual, which is a psychological claim. And paragraphs 11 to 25 in this commentary on the Golden Flower each separately set off an atomic bomb in my mind. Shouldn't Dr. Jung's writing come with a warning? Fair enough. I mean, he's been blowing my mind for years. That's all I can say. Okay, so in paragraph 12, what he's saying is, in psychological terms, we have common instincts of ideation and action across the whole human species. all based on unconscious archetypal patterns. It's stronger than our will. The instincts remain more or less constant. And one of the big points he makes here is that the more unconscious these instincts are, the more the psyche is conservative. That is why primitives do not change over thousands of years, because they fear the strange and unusual. And there's a famous... yeah. I'm not going to repeat that with the word in it for the video, but if people can see the chat, they can read it for themselves. But anyway, there's a famous Buddhist story where the famous Buddhist story is that there's a frog that lives in a mud puddle, and an older frog comes by and he says, you know, we ought to go hop over here and see the pond. And the young frog says, well, you know, this one seems pretty good. I'm going to stay here. And the older frog says, no, come on and see the pond. So they hop over to the pond, and the young frog says, wow, that's really awesome. You know, this is great, wonderful. And the older frog takes him out and shows him the ropes of the pond. And then next day he says, well, let's go see a lake. And the younger frog says, well, I can't imagine anything bigger than this pond. And the older frog says, well, come along, come see. And so they hop over, and then they see a lake. And then the next iteration, they see the ocean. And in the Buddhist story, when the young frog sees the ocean, his mind just explodes. So that's kind of what you and Dan are talking about here, where the more consciousness you get, the more frightening it is. And so one further point in this paragraph 12 is the higher and wider consciousness gets from assimilation of unfamiliar, the more autonomy it gets. And so what happens is it rebels against the old gods who held their consciousness in thrall. And so the more, your consciousness is contained, let's say, as Dr. Edinger discussed in one of his lectures, and it's either contained in a religion or in a perspective on your world, as the frog had. But once your mind has stretched out, then you can't go back. And so whatever was holding you in thrall before, you can't go back. It's like going to university and then trying to go back to your hometown. Let's suppose that you live in a Ohio farm community, and then you go to Columbus to the 30,000 student campus of Ohio State. Well, then it's very hard to go back. And the classic song about that from World War I is, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? And, that's very much what we're talking about here, that, you have a different perspective and things will change. And of course, the fact that our young men went to war and did end up seeing places like Paris and Rome and London, etc., did cause them to come back and change the face of America in the 20th century. They certainly did. So in paragraph 13, then, you get stronger and more independent as your ego expands, and the more unconscious is pushed into the background, and it reaches instinctual atrophy. And so it gives you freedom, but it has a tendency toward hubris, so it can also get you knocked down. And, obviously that's not particularly good. And so what Dr. Edinger emphasizes in one of the two lectures is that you're between this rock and a hard place, and on one side is hubris and inflation, and the other side is the rocks. And it's the classic in the classic story of Ulysses. It's Scylla and Charybdis. Going between Scylla and Charybdis, you have to go right down the middle, because if you go too far one side or too far the other side, you're going to go on the rocks. Because if you're too prideful, then you're going to come down. And if you don't have enough self-esteem and ego, then you're going to come down because of depression, or you're already down, but you won't be able to get up. And so what happens is the collapse of people with weaker ego, members of the society. So what Dr. Jung mentions is that Yang starts to turn into yin at 12 o'clock noon. And so this is a cycle that's always going on. You can't escape it. And we've pushed things very far on the logos side in Christian societies for the last 2,000 years, and that's starting to be problematic. Or not starting to be, it's been problematic for 150 years. Okay, paragraph 14. Psychologists see these movements in life. For example, the successful businessman becomes like a querulous old woman, and this destroys him. Somebody who's extremely successful has made great successes. Suddenly he becomes embittered and doesn't live well after that. So a one-sided exaggeration leads to yin, and that's the reaction from the unconscious pulling you down, actually. And so if you believe where there's a will, there's a way, that's what the Third Reich believed. Okay, that's the point that Dr. Jung makes about the Third Reich, that they believe where there's a will, there's a way, and so they thought that they could take over the world, and others have different ideas about that, and so what happened is all the crockery got broken, and it can happen again to us. In fact, it's 8 minutes after 9, so I don't know if our minute is up yet. So anyway, so consciousness and the will are our highest achievements, but what use is morality that destroys the man? Morality can be a sign of barbarism, and he says wisdom is better. Okay, so the point about the whole secret of the golden flower is it's about wisdom and the biological development of wisdom over time.